Saint Parascheva, or Saint Petka, or Sfânta Vineri, as she is known among Bulgarians and Serbians and Romanians, is one of the most traveling saints as far as the journey of her relics are concerned. To these journeys, we owe the creation of a particular holy space, congregating the Balkan Slavs and the Romanians, the peoples among which Saint Parascheva had the connotation of holy protector of the realm, of the ruler and of the people. This strongly political dimension of his veneration as divine defender, holy patron, and intercessor of the political power, first in Bulgaria and later with other Balkan Slavs and the Moldavians, is definitely one of the most characteristic features of St. Paraskeva's cult and in the Middle Ages and early modern period, discernible in both textual and visual narratives dedicated to the Holy Woman. More precisely, her reputation as a powerful city-defending saint developed after the transfer of her relics to Târnovo, where her veneration started to be perceived as a type of substitution of the Marial city-defending cult within the empire. It decisively marked the ensuing hagiographical narratives of Saint Parascheva, as well as the history of her relics. However, while their transfer to the capital of the Second Bulgarian Empire remains definitely the most significant and famous translatio of the revered Holy Woman, and therefore it shall not be discussed at length here, between 14th and 17th centuries. Saint Paraskeva's relics traveled 5 more times throughout the Balkan area before they reached their final destination at Iași. As a general remark, one should keep in mind that each relocation of holy relics implied 2 topographical landmarks, the departure point and the destination point. Concerning the first one, evidence seems to suggest that Saint Paraskeva's relics usually left their dwelling as a consequence of some disastrous historical events. Byzantium was conquered by the Latins and the holy body went to Târnovo. Târnovo was conquered by the Ottomans and the relics went to Vidin. Vidin was conquered by Bayezid I and Saint Parascheva went to Serbia. Belgrade was conquered in 1521 by Suleiman the Magnificent, and Suleiman the Magnificent took the relics with him to Constantinopol. Finally, they left the imperial capital of the imperial capital for Moldavia on the background of the catastrophic financial situation of the Patriarchy at this time. As for the destination point, Saint Paraskeva's relics after these successive transfers, they were always determined by the ruler's intention of accumulating holiness and claiming legitimacy. Only the case of 1521 differs from this scenario. The Sultan cannot legitimate his power through an object of Christian veneration. Therefore, one can wonder whether it is appropriate to investigate this case together with the other 4. At the first look, the difference from all the other translations are too many and too significant to allow such an association. On the other hand, considering its finality, this is definitely another transfer of the saint's relics, and moreover, one that was accounted as such and referred to it in 17th century sources, as we shall see later. But first, let's pursue the various cases. The first journey of the saints' relics took place soon after the Great Battle of Klokotnitsa in 1230, when Bulgarian Tsar Jonathan defeated the Western Byzantine Basileus Theodore Komnenos Dukas and became the ruler of almost the entire Balkan Peninsula. The events are well documented and thoroughly studied in previous historiography. The translatio in 1231 to Târnovo and the ensuing spreading of her veneration among the Slavs became the basis on the creation of the huge literary tradition, translation from Greek as well as reduction of an original Vita, panegyrics and divine services in Slavonic. The second journey of the relics occurred after the fall of Târnovo in 1393. The holy body was taken from the capital of the Second Empire and conveyed to another imperial city, Vidin, where Tsar Ioan Strațimir, the last ruler of the Ascend dynasty, was still in power. This translatio should be studied in correspondence with the third one, from Vidin to Serbia, which took place after the fall of Ioan Strațimir, following the catastrophe of the Crusaders' army in 1396. Both of them were accounted by Gregory Zamblak and also by Metropolitan Iosaf of Vidin in his panegyric of Saint Philotea. Both occurred in context of an already existing veneration of the saint among the Orthodox Slavs, with a strong connotation of her protective functions and obvious political implication of her cult. This could explain the special efforts made by the rulers of Vidin or of Serbia, Tsar Ioan Strațimir and Princess Bilica, as well as Stefan Lazarevic, to obtain the relics. After the death of the despot Stefan Lazarevic in 1427, the city of Belgrade, the last capital of Serbia, was ceded to the Hungarians and remained about a century in their hands. Hungary was a great power in Central Europe that could still oppose to the Ottoman advance. Nevertheless, the city was conquered on 29th of August 1521, and thus the door to Europe was open. Hungary itself fell some years later, and the Sultan leaned over Italy because the actual goal of the Ottomans was Rome. This brought up the fourth travel of St. Paraskeva's relics from Belgrade to Constantinople, escorted by the Sultan's army. What was the character of this event? Rather poorly documented, this transfer of the relics is nevertheless mentioned in some chronicles, and it is the subject of several notes and letters. The scarce information we get from these sources indicates that Soliman I brought from Belgrade not only St. Paraskeva's relics, but also those of Empress Theophano and a miraculous icon of Our Lady. All three precious objects for the Christians were mentioned in several Serbian and Venetian sources. Usually, these events are presented as a part of the attack against Sirmium, Srem, and the surrounding region with the capture of the population there. They were also related to the Latin Chronicle, in the Latin Chronicle written for the despot George Brankovic. A significant element of the tale is worth paying attention to. The victorious Ottoman army organized resettlement of the local Serbian population from the Danubian cities to Constantinople. We mention this because it could have influenced the transfer of the relics to the most venerated saints from Belgrade to the capital city. We find some important suggestions in a contemporary author, Ludovicus Tubero. The text relates that after the capture of Belgrade, Suleiman decided to relocate a part of the Serbian population from the strategic city to Constantinople. Of course, this must have been a tragedy for them, so they asked the Sultan to take with them the relics of Saint Parascheva. After obtaining the permission, they departed. In this respect, we can find two significant evocations. Primo, the source mentions that it was at the insistence of the citizens of the Danubian town and only with the permission, not organization and insistence, but with the permission only of the Ottoman power that the holy body was taken with them. So, the initiative of the transfer belonged to the Christians forced to leave their home and not to the Ottoman ruler. But, secundo, a different opinion states that it was the Sultan who brought the relics to Constantinople in order to reinforce the faith in his capital. If we interpret the text in the sense that the transfer of Saint Parascheva occurred at demands of the captive Serbian population of Belgrade, the relics might have also functioned as a sort of self-conduct for escorting the relocated Christian subjects. Nevertheless, even in this scenario, the Sultan's implication for the transfer is unquestionable, since his approval must have been decisive. Moreover, an engraving illustrating Metropolitan Balaam's Kazania from 1643 and also other sources depicts the Sultan actively taking part in the endeavor, riding his horse victoriously. This is in the bottom left-hand part. Riding his horse victoriously in front of the carriage with the relics. But we will come back to this representation later. Some interesting data is to be found in a description of the Church of Our Lady Pamakaristos in Constantinople, written before 1588. It says that Saint Parascheva's relics were deposited there in a side chapel, together with those of Saint Theophano and Saint Mercurius. This description indicates that after the fall of Belgrade, Sultan Suleiman took the relics to Constantinople and then sent them to the Patriarch Jeremiah I. Nobody dared to enter the side chapel under threat of death. However, the people could have a narrow peek to the relics. The text is quite confusing. It does not answer why Suleiman brought the relics in Constantinople, why he gave them to the Patriarch, why were the relics locked. It is to be noted that Patriarch Jeremiah I became head of the Ecumenical See on December 31, 1522, so probably more than a year after the arrival of the relics. Does this mean that the Sultan did not give the relics immediately to the Patriarchy? Why so? All these questions remain unanswered. Additional suggestions are provided by the text of the priest Synadinus from Ceres, who also referred to the staying of Saint Parascheva's relics in Constantinople. The account sincerely relates that the Patriarchy offered the relics to Vasile Lupu in exchange to his promise to pay off the depths of the ecumenical sea. The Ottoman power was not implied in the affair, at least as far as the text suggests. According to Synodinus, the saint did not perform any miracle in Constantinople for more than a century because she lacked the proper veneration there. Could this mean that the relics were isolated and deprived of worshippers by the will of the Ottoman power, which might have considered them dangerous because of their potency? Such a conclusion would contradict the idea that Saint Parascheva was deliberately brought by Suleiman to his capital because her relics were very important for his Christian subjects and therefore worthy to be brought from Belgrade in order to reinforce the authority of the ruler, even Muslim. Or maybe for the Ottoman Sultan, they were just precious holy objects made inaccessible through their deposition in a locked chapel. In this case, we cannot further insist on the idea that the Sultan brought the body from Belgrade in order to impress his Christian subjects. Alas, the text of the priest from Ceres does not give us additional explanation on this respect.
Finally, the last journey of Saint Parascheva took place in 1641 from Constantinople to Iași at the request and great expense of the Moldavian prince Vasile Lupu. The circumstances of the affair are well known in the existing literature. The ambitious and rich Moldavian prince received the holy body from the patriarchy as a sort of compensation for paying back in full its huge financial debts. He additionally spent a considerable amount of money in order to obtain the approval of the Ottoman authorities for the transportation of the holy body and their safe journey to Moldavia. The same writing of priest Synodinus of Ceres relates the ceremonial adventures once the relics reached their new destination. They were deposited in the Trei church in Iași. This was Vasile Lupu's most significant foundation, meant to become the necropolis of his family. Erected and consecrated only several years earlier, in 1639, the church was still in the process of receiving its lavish decoration when the relics arrived. Sorin Iftimi considers that the edifice had been designed and especially prepared from the very beginning to host the revered body, while Maria Magdalena Sechei suggests that it was meant to become the new metropolitan residence of Moldavia. Several traveler accounts of the same period describe the original shrine of the relics inside the church under a special canopy next to the sanctuary. According to the original inscription installed at the base of this canopy, the relics of Saint Parascheva arrived in Moldavia on June 13, 1641, sent here by the ecumenical patriarch Parthenius I and accompanied by 3 high hierarchs from Constantinople. More important for our topic, the inscription states that this was their 3rd translatio. This was obviously a mystification, since we have already seen that the relics had traveled much more before their final journey to Iași. But which of these travels were intentionally omitted, and why? In the attempt to answer this question, the analysis of visual sources becomes very helpful. The transfers of Saint Parascheva's relics were recorded not only in writing, but also in visual sources, in narrative cycles dedicated to the Holy Woman in post-Byzantine art. However, such representations are neither numerous nor various. Strangely enough, no illustrations of any transfer of Saint Parascheva's relics have survived from medieval Bulgaria and Serbia. The earliest pictorial hagiographical cycles dedicated to the Holy Woman were preserved in several 15th century Polish Ruthenian icons, estimated to amount to more than a dozen. A recent article published by Father Gabriel Herea proved very useful for the present research, and I took the liberty to borrow several pictures from there. Dating mostly from the 15th century, they are large vita icons, usually depicting the portrait of Saint Parascheva in the middle and various episodes from her life on the margins. The visual narratives are all indebted to the hagiography of Eusebius of Târnovo, by Eusebius of Târnovo. Numerous small episodes on the margin refer to the posthumous history of the saints' early remains from their initial, and this icon is very illustrative in this sense. So episodes referring to the relics, from their initial burial to the later miraculous discovery of the body, their proper inhumation in the church of Epivat, and finally their transfer to Târnovo. For instance, in this 15th century icon from the right side, preserved in the Historical Museum of Sanahu, 7 out of 10 narrative episodes refer to the history of the relics and not to the events from Parascheva's life. The iconographical selection may vary from one icon to the other, as you can see. However, the translatio scene to Târnovo is never missing. Moreover, this representation is usually given prominence within the visual narrative as a conclusive scene, as it can be seen in this icon from the National Museum in Warsaw, where it occupies almost the entire lower register. Despite the strong focus on the history of relics, this is the only translatio of Saint Parascheva illustrated in these Polish Ruthenian icons. The fact is somehow surprising, since in her recent monograph on the textual hagiographical tradition of Saint Parascheva, Evelina Mineva has pointed out that the medieval manuscripts from the Polish-Lithuanian territory present the extended version of the Vita by Patriarch Eutimius, which also contains the story about the transfer of the Holy Body to Belgrade, written by Gregory Țamblac. A similar situation is to be found in the elaborated mural cycles dedicated to Saint Parascheva in the decoration of 2 16th century Moldavian churches, long time before the transfer of her relics to Iași. Elca Bacalova has dedicated a special study to these frescoes, and more recently Constantin Ciobanu. Both the hagiographical cycle in Arbore, on the bottom register in the image. Here you can see clearly images related to the relics. You can discern more than see. And the cycle in Roman, this register here in the middle. So both of them contain several episodes referring to the relics, each concluding with 2 successive translatio scenes, the one to the Saint Apostle Church in Epivat, and respectively the transfer of 1231 to Târnovo. The fresco in Arbore is barely visible and impossible to be identified without the inscription, while the frescoes from Roman, here you can see, the frescoes from Roman, so in these frescoes, the juxtaposition of the 2 mentioned translations is very clear, and you have the separate episodes here. This is the transfer to Epivat, and then the transfer to Târnovo. It has been shown that the textual prototypes of the pictorial cycles are the short version of the Vita written by Eutimius, Patriarch Eutimius. This could explain why the translatio to Târnovo is always the last scene of these narratives, even if it was notorious that Saint Parascheva relics were no longer at Târnovo at the time these frescoes were painted. The account of Gregory Țamblac about their transfer to Belgrade was well known in Moldavia, as well as the information about their transfer to Constantinople in 1521. The mid-17th century chronicle of Bishop Macarie, shepherd of the church in Roman, and most probably commissioner of its frescoes, including the images you have just seen, clearly proves that. Why then the only transfers of the relics depicted in church decoration were the ones mentioned in the short version of Eutimius' text? Why neglecting the other 2 translaciones to Vidin and to Belgrade? A possible explanation for this could reside in the enormous authority and influence of Patriarch Eutimius in the Orthodox world. Even so, this explanation is not sufficient, because the authority of Gregory Țamblac was not negligible either. Moreover, his texts were intended and circulated as an appendix of the Vita written by Patriarch Eutimius. So the explanation must be sought elsewhere. Was it because they had not been solemnly performed as ceremonial relics translation in the very complicated context of the Ottoman presence, or perhaps because they did not benefit from proper translatio accounts in the hagiographical text. This is really hard to tell. A last visual source we discuss here might shed new lights on these issues, or even complicate it more. This is the famous engraving of Varlam's Kazania, the first collection of homilies and saint lives translated into Romanian. Its author was the Metropolitan of Moldavia at the time, directly involved in the transfer of the relics to Iași in 1641. Surprisingly though, in his book, Saint Parascheva's hagiography faithfully replicates the short version written by Patriarch Eutimius and does not even mention the recent translatio to Iași. This omission is rather strange, but we will not discuss it here. More important for our purpose is that the engraving accompanying the text fully compensates for this lack and illustrates not one, but 3 translatio scenes. The image shows Saint Parascheva the Sender, surrounded by 9 episodes from her life. The one on top illustrates the transfer of the saint's relics to Târnovo, while the 2 scenes from the bottom register depict the transfer of the relics from Belgrade to Constantinople and by Sultan Suleiman, and respectively from Tsarigrad to Iași, here, by Voivod Vasile Lupu, as stated in the corresponding inscriptions. Please note the fact that the engraver visually marked the distinction between the last 2 journeys. While the Moldavian one is depicted like a proper ceremonial translatio, with the hierarchs holding the chase on their shoulders and the prince devoutly participating in the procession, in the Ottoman one, the relics are carried in the backboard, the Sultan riding his horse in glory in front of them. After the conquest of Belgrad, he is portrayed victoriously returning to his capital, accompanied by the famous relics, as a symbol of his enhanced power, maybe. But more interestingly, both the engravings are and the inscriptions state that these were the second and the third translatio of the saint. What could have motivated such an innovative choice of the engraver compared to the previous representations of the saint, as we have seen? According to Paul of Aleppo, who relates his visit to the Trei-Arch Church in 1653, the wall behind the reliquary under the canopy was illustrated with episodes from Saint Parascheva's life, and most importantly, with at least 2 translatio scenes, the one to Constantinople by the will of the Ottoman Sultan, and most probably the last transfer to Iași, when the relics were brought by the 3 Greek metropolitans, as we have seen, când au adus-o episcopii. Unfortunately, the original images are lost. Nevertheless, Paul of Aleppo's testimony clearly indicates that at least the transfer of the relics to Constantinople was illustrated in their shrine in Iași. This was most probable, in my opinion, the visual prototype for the engraving by Ilia in the book, in Varlam's book. What could be the message of such a selection? Any movement of a saint from one place to the other implies a double statement of authority. One towards the place from which the relics come, the other towards the place to which they go. In our case, the unique association of the 3 translaciones implies a more complex statement of authority, since the engraving is showing Saint Parascheva traveling from Târnovo via Constantinople to Iași. This unexpected iconographical solution offered the necessary addition to the recent history of Saint Parascheva's relics, but also carried interesting political implications. Ivan Biliarsky has shown elsewhere that after the arrival of the relics to Târnovo, Saint Parascheva was venerated among the Slavs and the Romanian as a special protector of the city and of the state, in a similar way to the role played by Theotokos in relation to Constantinople. In visual terms, the transfer of the relics to Iași, their last journey, is clearly associated to the Târnovo moment. They are represented in a similar manner, suggesting a certain continuity. Saint Parascheva was definitely brought to Moldavia as a divine palladium, a divine helper, protector of the new capital and of the princely power of Vasile Lupu. However, she was brought from Constantinople after complex negotiations with the Patriarchy and with the Sultan's approval. The intermediary representation of the Ottoman transfer indicates exactly where the relics came from before their last transfer to Moldavia. Maria Vasilevich has shown in a recent article on translaciones of saints' relics in the late Balkans, in the context of the growing Ottoman power, that most of them were purchased by Christian rulers with the Sultan permissions, but without affecting the significance of their sacralizing presence at their new destinations. This was definitely the case with Saint Parascheva's relics from the 14th century on in their journeys to Vidin, Serbia, and then to Moldavia. By portraying the Sultan carrying the saint relics to Constantinople, the images indicate not only their place of origin at the time, but also the Sultan's approval for the last journey. Nonetheless, the different manner of representation compared to the more ceremonial transfers to Târnovo and to Iași suggests that the relics finally regained their proper veneration in Moldavia. Thank you very much.
I think that this is the main point, the main problem. Why a Muslim ruler should transfer the relics? Is this a purely religious act, somehow religious, or it is motivated by another reasons? For example, political, I mean, are a part of the religious. Because there was a question of money in the last translation to Iași, I do not believe that this was the question to sell the relics to the Patriarchy. This is not the answer, I think.
Aș face din nou o paralelă cu un episod din istoria țării românești, pentru că l-am amintit pe Neagoe Basarab astăzi. Și aș aduce aminte că în viața Sfântului Nifon, în momentul în care Vlad cel Tânăr este executat și înlocuit de Mehmed Pașa din ordinul sultanului cu Neagoe Basarab, turcii apar drept cei care împlinesc voința divinității. Deși sunt necredincioși, chiar textul spune asta, cu toate că era necredincios, Mehmed Pașa a acționat în spiritul celor decise pe un plan divin. S-a mai susținut, au fost alții mult înainte de ce spun eu acum, care au arătat că în anumite situații sultanul este privit ca un continuator legitim al împăraților bizantini și în context cred că reprezentarea lui Suleiman chiar asta vrea să sugereze, deși este un necredincios, până la urmă este un suveran legitim care cumva se implică în procesul de transfer al moaștelor în locul în care trebuiau să ajungă, la Iași, la curtea lui Vasile Lupu. Este sigur doar o speculație, dar cred că imaginile pot fi citite și în acest fel. Mulțumesc.
Mulțumim.
Mulțumesc și eu. Se implică așa într-un plan al proniei divine în 1521, deci mult înainte. Dar cred că imaginea poate fi generică, referindu-se la sultan în general, nu la Soliman în particular. Și mi se pare interesant că, sigur, noi avem astăzi păstrată doar gravura din Cazania lui Varlam, pe care o tot analizăm. Dar sugestia lui Paul din Alep, mie mi se pare foarte convingătoare pentru faptul că probabil acolo, sub baldachin, erau pictate aceste scene. Și de acolo trebuie să fie inspirat Ilia, gravorul, când probabil la Iași a creat gravurile acestea pentru carte. Așadar, chiar în sanctuarul Sfintei era reprezentat acest moment intermediar al transferului otoman al moaștelor.
I'm not sure that I understand exactly the question of Ovidiu, but I would like to say that...
It was not a question, it was a short commentary.
Okay, yes, I agree, if I understood well. There are two things, two interesting points. First is that Suleiman was welcomed somehow in Belgrade. It was not a conquest by force and by weapons somehow, by Serbians, not by Hungarians, of course. And the other is that all the transfers of relics in Bulgaria at least, but not only, in Serbia too, in the first century or century and a half of the Ottoman rule in the Balkans were helped by the Ottoman power. They were helped by Ottoman power. And this is a political point, of course. Of course, this is not generosity, something like. Also, it is interesting to state that in the lives of the neo-martyrs of Sofia, at least, because this tradition continues up to 19th century, the Ottoman power is not bad. Not very good, of course, but not bad. The problem is the crowd, the Muslim crowd. And the Ottoman governor tried to save the saint from the martyrdom, but the crowd forced him to perform this, or they actually acted by themselves. Okay.
Thank you. Father Dosoftei, Părintele Dosoftei, vă rog.
Vreau să spun că un sultan poate să apară într-o scenă sau un cadiu, de exemplu, cum este la moaștele Sfântului Ioan, sau un grup de păgâni, pentru că, nu numai pentru că el a permis sau că a avut un rol foarte special, ci pentru că, în general, în momentele acestea, să spunem așa, de maximă intensitate din punct de vedere al vieții unui sfânt, cum este martiriu sau cum este mutarea moaștelor, cumva ceea ce se întâmplă acolo este întru totul vegheat de Dumnezeu și atunci cel care încearcă să redea momentul acela redă cu, să spunem așa, toate elementele componente. De exemplu, în biserici apare scena, mă rog, tablou votiv, să spunem așa, că ar fi un fel de scena ctitoririi. Și el apare acolo între celelalte scene care sunt cu oameni sfinți sau așa, pentru că, practic, în momentul ăla a fost un gând al Dumnezeu care s-a împlinit atunci. Și atunci este necesar ca el să fie fixat de cel care narează, care spune narațiunea respectivă. Nu știu dacă am fost foarte clar. Cu ce a început domnul Ovidiu Cristi, am vrut să extind lucrul acesta. Prima propoziție, fraza dumnealui, am vrut să o extind. Atât. Mulțumesc.